I went to Israel as a young teenager and a young Zionist. Did a number of programs, studying Hebrew, living and working on kibbutz. When I was 14, I stayed for a while on a new settlement on the West Bank. Over the years was exploring different kind of ways of being a Jew in Israel. For me, leaving South Africa and apartheid was, it was something that I wanted to do, and Israel for me was a way that I could do that. I went back again in the mid-2000s, and I'd already become much more involved and active in Palestinian human rights issues. And in 2009 I went to stay on the West Bank and experience the conditions of everyday life under the occupation, under military rule, behind the wall, engaging the checkpoints multiple times a day. It was during Ramadan, it was boiling hot, and it was very challenging, very painful.
I actually stayed in Bethlehem, which is in the West Bank, and so lived with the people in the occupied territories. I think the most important thing that strikes you is this big wall, this massive security wall that is around Bethlehem, and gives you the impression of you being in a prison, really, like an big open air prison. Israel says they are doing it for security. If that was the case, I think they would have built it on the Green Line, which is really what the West Bank borders should be. But what they've actually done is they've built it inside the West Bank. And so what you have, for example, you have a family whose house is right next to the wall, but they had a few acres of land this way, but now that land is being taken away from them because the wall just took it. So there's the family staying, and they have maybe a few meters of space, and then the wall here, and then their land is over here.
I haven't been to the West Bank and Gaza, but what I experienced there was absolutely shattering. On the one hand, there was a group of people who'd worked hard for my release because they didn't like apartheid, but more because I was a Jew. A secular Jew, a non-Zionist Jew, but a Jew. My daughter was on the kibbutz. She chose to go there, wanted to be a member. The attitude of the kibbutz was members' problems have to be dealt with. Her problem was a daddy in prison. And so they set about trying to help negotiate my release. The shock I found was the ease with which Jewish Israelis speak about Israel and Israelis, forgetting that they are Palestinian Israelis. And when I said, but that sounds like the racism of apartheid, they of course vehemently denied it. But in fact they don't acknowledge that there's anybody else. Israel is Jewish. There are separate laws for Palestinians, and they talk to me about Jews, Palestinian Israelis, Palestinians who are not Israelis, Arabs and Arab Israelis. These classifications, it's like apartheid race classification, and they couldn't see it. When I was asked to talk to people about South Africa and describe the way in which the churches, schools, Scout movements, guide movements, pioneers, Voortrekker movement and so on, were all used to inculcate the idea of white superiority, and religion of course as well. They said, my God, that's like Israel. Why are you telling us about Israel? I thought you were speaking about South Africa. I just don't like people who kill others for no reason, except personal gain. And because they do it as a state, they say it's legitimate. If it was private, it would be murder and theft. Absolutely true. And I can't understand. We've forgotten what it is to be oppressed and what it is to suffer the brutality. And what I find most appalling is that young Jews doing military service, young men and young women, are consciously made to brutalize Palestinian people. The stories are legion, and they're not just anecdotes, of women refused passage through the checkpoints to go and have a baby, and having a baby there without help. In modern society, the use of helicopter gunships, the flattening of inner city areas. This is Holocaust stuff. This is the Warsaw Ghetto. We should have learned from it not to do it, because in the long run it's not an answer to the problem, except extermination. And religious hatred must lead to gas chambers. That's the tragedy. And I'm appalled by it. So my answer is it's a very good statement.
Yeah, that's a simplistic question. When one tries to draw a parallel between items which actually cannot be easily put into a box, you can come out with gobbledygook, and that's partly gobbledygook. There's no question that Jews have been oppressed. We know that over thousands of years. There's also no question either that now that the Jewish people have returned to their ancient homeland and are in a position of power, that to some extent that's become complicated. So they're not brutally oppressing the Palestinians. That is an unfair statement to say. What people have to understand is that the issue of Palestine and Israel is just not as simple as what was in South Africa, that there is one group of people who have been brutally oppressed by a minority or majority, and that's it. In Israel, Palestine, it's more complicated. That there is some oppression, I would say yes. That the Palestinian people, to a large extent, are living in a state of discomfort, I would say yes. That responsibility doesn't only fall with the state of Israel, the Jewish-run state of Israel. The Palestinians are people that are oppressed by their own people, both within the West Bank by the Palestinian Authority, and if you look at Palestinians who are in Lebanon, Palestinians who are in Jordan, they are the ultimately oppressed people all over the world, but not necessarily by the Jews.
I think that's a very incisive and insightful statement, and a very important one, because I think that the mentality of collective victimhood, which I think a lot of Jewish people carry, because the Shoah, the genocide against Jews, was only, it was yesterday in historical terms, and we know that those kinds of mass atrocities have an intergenerational effect. They do impact the way that generations after experience their own kind of existential security in the world. So I think it's very difficult for Jews to imagine that they're experienced as militaristic, totalitarian bullies. It's very difficult for Jews to kind of have that experience of how they're experienced outside, because there's that internal feeling of being besieged and being under threat, and that anti-Semitism in the world has not gone away. And therefore, as long as that's the case, Israel as a Jewish homeland has to be defended at any cost. But the cost of that is a very, very brutal dehumanization and a kind of oppression of Palestinians without acknowledging the violence of that. I think it's a very, very important insight.
I don't personally use that kind of language because I think to say the Jews is too, everyone is now under the same brush. There are many, many Jewish people who are against the occupation of Palestine. I could perhaps use the language of the Israelis. That will come closer to what the reality is that Israel has now not only have they occupied Palestine, but they've also taken land that would be, some people would think might be a future Palestinian state, and they've gone to build settlements in that, and so effectively they've encroached onto the West Bank and so on what might be a future Palestinian state. They've also created two completely different systems, whereby one group of people live in one system and are able to use only certain roads and so on and so forth, and another group of people live in a completely different system, a military system actually. Yes, they have become oppressors.
I had a very bizarre experience at a Jewish settlement on the West Bank, where a group of South Africans went to interview who invited us to sit and talk with him about why his notion of this maximalist Zionism, like both sides of the River Jordan, why this was mandated by God, why it's important for the world to understand that there's no injustice in that, and he did something that I remember white South Africans doing during apartheid. There was an Arab village near the settlement, and he had employed a Palestinian guy from the village to work, at the Jewish settlement. So this Palestinian guy, who's a simple worker, who is obviously depending in a very kind of like strangulated economic environment for Palestinians with the wall and with the kinds of constraints that Israel's imposed on Palestinian life. It's very, very difficult to make a living for specifically working class Palestinians. I mean, middle class manage in other ways. And he asked the labourer to sit with us and drink tea. And he turned to the man and he said, tell the people how we treat you. And I remember, the kind of madams inviting maids to sit down when visitors came from overseas, saying, we'll ask the girl to tell you how we read, and she'll tell you that if there was black rule, blacks would kill each other, and it was, we got the same story.
Look, there's no question about it. I do identify parallels. In fact, my own view is that saying that Israel is an apartheid state is mild. Israel is more than an apartheid state. It is worse than an apartheid state. I mean, there's no time in the history of apartheid South Africa that there was, for example, a wall built around Transkei or Bophuthatswana or anything like that, or where bombs were dropped on Gaza. And there were no time in our history where only white people could drive on certain roads and not black people or colored people, whatever. No time in our history when that happened. That's happening in Israel today, and in the settlements in particular. So it's a worse form of apartheid. The implication of that for me is that if the world took a particular stand against apartheid, it must take an even stronger stand against what Israel is doing at the moment. And it's happening, it's beginning to happen. I worked with many Jewish activists against apartheid in this country. Many Jewish people stood with Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement in the US and so on. And so it's clear to me that there were many Jewish people who were against apartheid in South Africa, but the majority of the Jewish establishment in South Africa were not against it. They were quiet, and they even persecuted people like Ronnie Kasrils and other Jewish activists. They did not recognize them, and only after apartheid in the democracy have now begun to almost recognize them and sort of say, oh, you're actually part of us. But of course, they at the same time, they're giving people like Ronnie Kasrils and others a hard time, because Ronnie says, and Ronnie's even more clear than I am about this, that Israel is an apartheid state. So you have Jewish activists now saying to the Jewish establishment in South Africa that you better take a strong stand against, but of course many of the Jewish establishments in South Africa won't do that.
Let me tell you this, to the untrained eye, if you watch media clips, you'll see a group of heavily armed soldiers and a group of young people, and the young people throwing stones at the heavily armed soldiers. It brings back memories of apartheid. And when we'll talk about checkpoints with and you see soldiers there, it brings back some kind of memories of apartheid. But you dig a little deeper and it's just not the same. So I'll first say the very obvious stuff. Again, it needs to be said. Apartheid was a system that discriminated against black and white people based on race, two groups. There were specific rights that only white people could have, and specific oppressions that were only meted out to black people. In Israel, that's not the case. Israel itself, you must always differentiate between Israel, the border is what people call the green line, and the occupied territories. In Israel itself, Arab citizens, both whether they're Muslim or Christian, have full rights on law. There is a member of the Supreme Court who's a Muslim Arab. There are soccer players who are Muslim Arab. They have the right to vote. They have members of the Israeli Knesset are Muslim Arab. So that's nothing like apartheid. I lived during apartheid. You saw none of that. Blacks were wiped out of history and out of memory, more or less, and had no rights. Is there discrimination in Israel? Absolutely. Absolutely. But then again, you show me a country in the world where there is no discrimination, and I'd be very surprised.
Any state which makes laws for any group, religious or racial group, and singles them out for particular separate treatment is an apartheid state. And there's no question in my mind that this is so. And if you think about separate roads, separate living areas, a whole slew of laws, and finally, for me, the Israeli Supreme Court has on previous occasions ordered the Israeli Defense Force to remove Jewish settlers from Palestinian land. And the army has said, we cannot carry out your orders because we will not shoot at Jews. So where's the democracy if the courts, separation of powers, and courts will not be upheld? So the army and the state, and ultimately the judges, accede to the illegal occupation, read theft of land, because Yahweh said so. Found unacceptable.
For me, I think we have to do everything to believe and to dream into possibility that in our lifetime, in your lifetime, there will be that impossible, kind of unimaginable negotiation and solution and return of refugees. And that being said, even if it's not in your lifetime, we're still committed to continue that fight. I feel very passionate about commitment to this lifetime as well as beyond it. So not to yield to despair, to paralysis, to a sense of cynicism, because it is intractable, because precisely, at the height of some of the worst of apartheid repression, this civic movement really brought the regime to a place that it had to negotiate, it had to stop. It was unsustainable to continue on the track it was.
I'm always an optimist, and I would say I hope so. But it's going to need a huge shift in attitudes on both sides. And the attitude is that now that more than 90% of the Jordan River waters have been taken by the State of Israel and Israelis, that the old irrigation systems have been destroyed, olive and orange plantations destroyed, so that there is no economic viability for a Palestinian state. But then there is no viability for an Israeli state as it's presently constituted, without the massive subventions from the United States in particular. So what's the prospect for Israel? Nice scenario. China has to call in its credits from the United States, so that the United States can't fight wars all over the world. It stops the giving its subventions to Israel. Needs a bipartisan approach between the Republicans and Democrats, not to get the Jewish votes in New York and in California, because it's a decisive swing vote, but to agree not to do that on the basis of withdrawing support for Israel. And we would see it change very rapidly. No simple answers, I'm afraid. If there were simple answers, we wouldn't need political activity and I could sit and write and enjoy my life.
It has to happen within your lifetime. In fact, it has to happen sooner than within your lifetime. It's often described like this. In South Africa, what happened was there was a marriage. Okay, there was literally a marriage between, if you want to put it in the most simplistic terms, between the ANC and the National Party. It was agreement that they would come together and create a new South Africa. That's our history, and you were lucky enough to be pretty much born into that new reality. In the Middle East, we talk about a divorce. It's two lands for two people. So it's not the same. It's never going to be the same. People who talk about trying to impose the South African paradigm upon Israel-Palestine are sadly mistaken. They're people who don't live there, who don't understand that even the Palestinians themselves don't necessarily want that solution. We can't sit in South Africa from our vantage point and say, well, it worked for us, now let's give it to them. People who live in the Middle East must create their own reality, and it's not going to be like South Africa because the conditions are vastly different, the histories are vastly different, and so the unique solution has to be found. And it can be found, but Sophie, it's to people in your generation, it will not be found by trying to cast a villain and a hero. You see, in South Africa, this was a beautiful thing in a way about being South African at the time. Apartheid was a clear wrong. It was a wrong in everybody's eye, pretty much everybody's eye. It was clear. The white oppressive minority were the evil, they were the villains, and the oppressed black majority were the heroes. In Israel, it's not like that. To try and paint the Israelis as the villains and the Palestinians as these poor, lapless, helpless heroes is just simply not the case. The history is more complex. There's violence on both sides. There's been obstinance on both sides. There's been a lack of leadership and a lack of vision. Something has to change. And the only way it will change is if people stop trying to impose a solution from afar, and we actually support those people who are working for peace. Because I can tell you, as a Jew, as a South African, as an Israeli, and as a Zionist, that in your lifetime, the Jewish people will never accept what's called a one-state solution. It's just not on the cards now. Maybe in 50 years' time, who knows? One never knows what history holds. But right now, that'll not work. So people who are trying to hold out for that and trying to force that will actually just keep the Palestinians in an internal state of discomfort and dispossession. What we really need is to find ways in which the Palestinian people can have their own dignity in their own land and have self-determination the same way the Jewish people have in the state of Israel.
Well, I'm hoping that it will happen in your life. It's not going to come about out of the goodness of Israel's heart. It really is not going to happen. We know that. And from past experience now over many, many years in terms of negotiations, I don't think it will become as a result of those kind of negotiations either. Eventually they have to negotiate, and the negotiations will have to happen genuinely, not fake negotiations, actually real negotiations. So the only answer that I have at the moment is that the rest of the world, the rest of the global community, must put so much pressure on Israel, as they did against South Africa, that Israel will eventually not have any choice but to negotiate, and to negotiate in good faith. That's the only, as a South African, I can't see anything else. In the UK, in London, they had 24/7 marches at Trafalgar Square, at the embassy, the South African embassy. That's the kind of thing one needs now today. It's not only when that starts to happen that they're going to have to put pressure on their own government and say, you must sort this out. But I don't see any other way. And I want to see a non-violent end. And so the only non-violent end that I can see is with boycott, divestment and sanctions against the state of Israel until they get to the point where they negotiate in good faith. Personally, I'm hopeful. The more young people and others start to take up the struggle and be very firm about it. Say we want justice. Yes, we don't want to wish Israel away. We don't want Israelis to be pushed into the sea and all of that. No, we don't want that. But neither do we want the suppression of the Palestinian people. And the only way then is to get the one in power to listen, and the one who is powerless, the Palestinians in this case, to be strengthened. And only when you set that balance right is then that you can have an equal negotiation. At the moment, I think it's not equal.